without further ado, I'll introduce our speaker who needs no introduction.
But I need to live. No, thank y'all so much for having me back. When Gerald was thinking about this, I thought, I'll do the Westminster, and no one asked me to. And I called my parents last night and they were talking like, what are you doing? I was like, oh, I'm teaching class on the Westminster. And they're like, we're so glad you enjoy that. And I was like, I hear that. Right there with bless your heart. But I actually do love the Westminster standards. The title was the Westminster Assembly, the Westminster Standards, the Westminster Catechism. We'll talk all about those wonderful terms that we have. But first, I'm going to do my best Rena Massey impression and ask you questions about the Catechism. No, not. But I feel this is a pop quiz, so get ready. And you can just shout it out, say it together. We're a class, this is teamwork. Friends, what is the chief end of man? Right. Minna gets a gold star on her performance chart. Raise your hand if you had to memorize the shorter catechism, not if you remember it now. Yeah, there you go. All right, raise your hand if you went to Mr. Belk's office and got a silver dollar for doing it. My grandmother made all of her children do it, but by the time the youngest one did it, it was a $5 bill. So inflation over 16 years. So yeah, Mr. Belk would do it. And then one of the leading scholars of the Old Testament in our denomination, Kathy Sackenfeld, who's a professor at Princeton. I was at a conference with her and she was saying something about the Westminster. And she said, I just remember doing it in front of Billy Wood's mom. And he was just trying to make me laugh during the entire thing, but I got my badge for it. Billy Wood. Oh, Bill Wood. I was like, hey, when he behave in Sunday school? And she wouldn't answer that one. No, but we say the Westminster Catechism, we say the Westminster Confession, but how many documents came out of the Westminster Assembly? Great. More.
5.
Okay, one more. Oh yeah,
6.
6. Yeah. No. So there actually are 6 documents that came out of the Westminster Assembly. We have the Confession, the Longer Catechism, the Shorter Catechism, the Directory for Public Worship of God, the Form of Presbyterial, didn't know that was a word, Church Government, and the Psalter for singing. So why the Westminster Standards? Why are they important to us? Why do we need to still learn them? They have been considered the most influential treatise on theology for the English-speaking world, primarily for Presbyterians, for over 300 years. It's also influential on the Baptist and the Congregational churches, not the Anabaptists, a very special Baptist that later became the Methodists. And it is the culmination of 125 years of theological thought. A lot of times they have divided the works of the Reformation into the first half and the second half, and the first half being creative, innovative, reformed, and the second half being sort of protective and scared and anxious, and they're trying to dub down on all of orthodoxy. But this is actually a great culmination of all of that. It's a great work. It really divides the age of faith between that and the age of reason or the age of enlightenment. So it really definitely marks a big shift in religious thought. The sort of, wouldn't say the end of the Reformation, but the culmination of it. And it is, I consider it the most successful failure we have seen in our creeds and confessions. We'll talk a lot more about that. But what's interesting is in a lot of the scholarship today, they're like, please give it a chance. It's this desperate pleading tone of, it's still valuable, it's still worth something. I've never thought that John Lee, who I've read a lot of, and if you've taken Sunday school class here, I'm sure you know John Lee, would have ever had a pleading tone. But that's what his introduction sounds like to me. He's just trying to convince us that Westminster is still worthy. And growing up, I always thought that's where you go. I didn't have to memorize it, thankfully. But it was the gold standard. You got to figure out what you believe. So it's interesting that it has gone through many phases of popularity and usage. But here we are today, and we are still making our children remember the catechism. They don't have to do this shorter. They do a much more abbreviated version, and so many wonderful people like Minna Elliott still remember what their Sunday school teachers taught them. But the creeds of the Reformation are very unique, and the creeds of the Reformed tradition had special characteristics. The Reformed churches were not scared to write a confession whenever they had the opportunity and whenever the occasion arose. There were over 50 creedal statements of some importance, which were formulated by Reformed communities between the 125 years between Martin Luther's theses and the Westminster Catechism. They really understood that theology was about a certain place and certain time. It was for the present. It wasn't supposed to be for the past, and it was never supposed to be eternal. It's not, theology is not an eternal truth. And they never wanted to raise one creed or confession over the others as trying to be the gold standard until they wrote the Westminster. It wasn't really supposed to be that way, but I think we have come to treat it that way. It's impossible to speak of Reformed theology, especially at this time, because there were so many confessions. The Westminster is slightly different, as I said, that its theological language and method were standardized by this time. This is where it's being innovative, it's being standardized. This document was written with a few hints at the time and the place of origin, but they really tried to make it sort of a blanket, broad statement on the language it's using. But there are a few things like calling the Pope the Antichrist and the way they write their academic or logical arguments. It's very easy to date this, and because of the language, you can even go further as to figure out where it is. And then we have treated it as the ultimate or final theological work. The Presbyterian Church US and the Southern Church used it as its only confession. Many churches have used it or still use it as its only confession. So we do think it, end all be all, the buck stops there, but truly it is like all of our other confessions where it's really marking a specific time, a specific place, and a specific beliefs for people. And just because of that, we can still use it. So the political background, what happened in 1533, where a young man who liked tennis and dancing and had nice calves decided to pursue a nice Catholic girl? No, Henry VIII. That's what he was known for. He liked tennis and dancing, and he had good calves. That was what historians say. He turned into a mutton-eating, portly man. Married Catherine of Aragon, and in 1533 he threw a fit because he couldn't get a divorce, and so he decided to pass the Act of Restraint of Appeals and ended the papal legal jurisdiction over the English Church. Meaning he pretty much said, Rome, you don't have any more power here. We're out. And then 1534 was the Act of Secession, and he became the supreme head of the church. So Henry VIII got his divorce and 5 other wives, as we know, and bless you for not being one of them. And then by that time, he was the head of the church. In 1547, his son, Edward VI, ascended the throne. Edward VI was really raised as a Protestant, and he had a genuine interest in spiritual matters and matters of faith. Henry really didn't care, and the church really remained very similar to what the Catholic Church was. It just is sort of a name instead of body. But Edward VI was truly interested in it, and he allowed the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, at the time, he allowed him a lot of authority and made it possible for him to write 42 articles, which would later become the 39 articles of the Anglican Church. And this is the theological statement of the Church of England. So 42 to 39, and we'll get back to those. And then also Cranmer was able to write 2 prayer books, one in 1549 and 1552. There will not be a quiz on that later. But Edward VI, as we know, died suddenly, and his half-sister Mary, quite contrary, and Bloody Mary, ascended the throne in 1553. And what was Mary's special characteristic? Just like her mother, she was a Catholic. So she came on board, and as the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, she revived the Catholic Church with a vengeance. I had one history professor that says Catholics burn people, but Protestants burn property. So we're like, oh, that's lovely. She, in the persecution of the Protestants, she had over 300 people burned at the stake for heresy, which was, I think, quadruple the amount in her father's persecution of the Catholics. So this is when you have a lot of people who are either having secret churches. Tons of Protestants fled to the continent, especially the Netherlands and Germany, to flee from Mary. But then all of a sudden, Mary, who was married to Philip of Spain, died all of a sudden, and her Archbishop of Canterbury died the same night. I will leave that there for you. And that truly ended the Catholic revival in the Tudor England. So then in 1558, we have Elizabeth I took the throne, and she was once more a Protestant country. But interestingly enough, she was not the head of the church, she was the governor of the church. So yeah. And so in 1552, she ordered that the prayer book must be used and vestments must be worn. So she is not liking these Presbyterians with their simplicity. She wants to go much more to, as they were saying, the Roman influence on the Church of England. But she really thought the Presbyterians were making trouble for her because they were increasing in popularity and they were demanding a lot more, trying to make the Church of England's government like that of the Presbyterians' polity, not the Episcopal polity. As I said, the monarch was no longer the supreme governor, or she was the supreme governor, not the supreme head. Well, when Elizabeth dies, who gets to take the throne? James 6 and 1. He's James the 6th of Scotland and James the 1st of England. So it just looks like James 7th when you write it. James 6 and 1, who's the son of Mary of Queen of Scots, who was a devout Catholic, was raised a Presbyterian. Don't go to family functions. They're very awkward with the family. And don't bring up religion or politics. You're going to offend or kill someone. While he was raised a Presbyterian, he was a devout studier of the faith. But when he began to gain more power as King of England and Scotland, he really embraced the idea of an absolute monarchy and the right of kings, which the Presbyterian polity doesn't really love. And so he found much more solace and much more support in the royalists of the episcopacy. So he really supported the episcopal form of government with bishops and him as the head of the church. That's really supported his kingdom. Well, his son ascended the throne and Charles I was even worse. When Charles III ascended the throne, I thought, whoa, we're going to get, it's a little guessy with that name.
Really?
But Charles I, he was not great, and he was worse than his father. He doubled down on being a Catholic. He married, not Catherine of Medici, it was one of the de Medicis of France, and they were extremely unpopular because of her religion. And he just decided to prod the bear and like throw a stone at the honey pot or the bee's nest. He decided that he was going to enforce the use of a prayer book in all services in Scotland, which incited 2 wars. The bishops' wars were exactly that. And the Scottish people trounced the king's men, and the English lost badly twice. So in their settlements of the Second Bishops' War, the Scottish demanded that Charles reconvene Parliament because he had not called it together in a long time. And this was known as the Long Parliament because it ran for 8 years when really they just were supposed to run for a few months up to a year, but it ran for 8 years. So he convenes the Long Parliament, and and then he's also he has to pay a large sum of money to the Scottish, and they are allowed to they are allowed a lot more freedom in Scotland, and he sort of tucks his tail and runs. Well, they weren't done with Charles I yet. So in 1641, Parliament issues the Grand Remonstrance, which is 200 items of things they did not like. So wouldn't that be lovely? That's great job feedback. So these were the list of problems that Charles had, and mainly it was about his Catholic, his Roman tendencies is what they said. That sounds like something fun. And that he was married to this poor woman, the little Medici girl, yeah. It also demanded that he have an assembly he called an assembly to Parliament that would advise them on spiritual matters. So well, we'll get to that in a moment. So he does. So Parliament calls this new council, and it is called the Westminster Assembly of Divines. So all the people out there were called the divines. They don't explain that well in the books. You're just sort of like, where are these angels? And I know a lot of ministers, I would not call them divines, but no. So when they call the divines, they are here to, what they're truly doing is the Presbyterians have now tricked the English into calling a council that will hopefully reform the Church of England into not just sort of good Calvinist thought, but really into Presbyterian polity, because that's what truly the Westminster Assembly is all about. Because a few things is England was Calvinist up to this time. It was pretty much accepted and it was not an issue. Yet under Charles I is when it really kind of got unpopular. They were then switched to called being the Puritans. That was the sort of derogatory name. The 39 articles of the Treatise of the Theological Beliefs of the Anglican Church are heavily Calvinist. Several of the bishops and archbishops of England were devoted Catholics. They wrote dissertations at Oxford and Cambridge on Calvin. It was just a Calvinist church, which we sometimes forget. And there was a big switch when further down the road. So, and then they also had a very unique way of writing Scholasticism was a medieval way of thinking, but then they created Reformed scholasticism, which is, this is the definition: the doctrine is logically deduced from the premise of eternal decree of God, and the history of salvation demarcated in two distinct covenants: the covenant of works before the fall, and the covenant of grace after it. There you go. That's the official definition. But we'll look at it a little bit more in the Westminster Catechism of that they switch from the why, which was more medieval, to the how. They're much more interested in not so much of why would God create man or humankind, but it's more of the how do we operate that we are created by God. We see that in the first question with what is the chief end of humankind. It is not about why would God create us or why would we do this. It's about how we're supposed to respond to God. And that goes into another aspect of this that we'll talk in a little bit. Actually, now there it is. It's covenantal theology. We hear that term all the time today, but really the Westminster introduced it. And covenantal theology for them was a liberating, personal understanding of faith. They moved from especially in the Reformation, the Orthodoxy had developed a doctrine of divine decrees, they called it, that carried the theologian to a dizzy height of the mind of God. Thank you, Johnny, for that beautiful statement. What really it means is they were so ethereal and so sort of theoretical statements that only really, really dull theologians would probably understand it. So what covenantal theology did was it focused on the working out of the experiential history and human experience. So decrees were decrees were made out of concrete facts of experience instead of just the theory of what we learn from as if we were God speaking in decrees. So this is relating to Calvin's understanding of to know God is to know yourself, and to know yourself is to know God. It's really based, and you can actually believe your experience and your senses almost, because they didn't want to trust those in the medieval period. So that's a really important aspect of the Westminster Assembly, that here we are, the personal experience, your personal faith as a way to understand your theology is extremely important. So the Assembly, what was it? So each parliamentarian of the House of Commons and the House of Lords was allowed to elect 2 ministers from his section, 1 from Oxford and 1 from Cambridge. And then there were 4 from London. So there were 121 ministers, or divines, as they called them. Then there were 20 members of the House of Commons. Then there are 10 members of the House of Lords. And New England was actually invited to have representation, but they said, no, we're good, thank you so much, and did not send anyone. Well, that didn't stop there. So I thought we just need a few more people. No. They began work, and so the doctrine that was their biggest task was to reform the 39 articles. And there were 4 main sides within the assembly. And they were all really based on, as I said, polity. So the Episcopalians, which are the royalists, they are the ones who appointed the bishops and the archbishop and thought it was super great. And Charles I was big fans of them, even though he had kind of run there bankrupt, but it's fine. Then there's the independents or the Congregationalists. This was Cromwell's, the Roundheads, those who would, as we would call them, Congregationalists. They were solid Calvinists, but thought the church, the congregation, a group of believers was just enough and had enough authority, and you didn't need anything else. They really believed in sort of the believer's baptism and all that wonderful things. Then there's the Erwastons, who they followed Aristus, who believed that the final authority of ecclesiastical matters landed in the civil authorities. Actually, most English Calvinists fell more under this crew than the Presbyterian Calvinists or the Scottish Presbyterians, because they really did not want civil authority over the church. The English were much more okay with it. So I would say if there was an issue about the ecclesiastical matters, that finally the civil court or the king could decide. So these were the 4, and then the Presbyterians, which are the Puritans, the English Presbyterians, and then we'll talk about the Scottish when they arrived. So they began to meet on Wednesday, July 1st, 1643, and their initial task was to revise the 39 articles. So then England needed support against the king's forces, because here we are, Charles is rebelling against Parliament. So there's a war going on around all these while they sit and discuss big ethereal ideas and covenantal theology. So the king's going after Parliament. England needs some money, so they asked Scotland to accept. They asked Scotland for help, and they said, "Sure, we'll do it for a price." And their price was sign on to our solemn league and covenant. So they made them sign up into a it was like a non-legal treaty between Parliament, which is only about half of represented about half of England, and then the rest of Scotland joined up. And what they realized is the Solemn League of Covenant would bind England, Scotland, and Ireland as a common confession of faith, a directory of worship, form of church government, and catechism. So the Scottish were really smart. They're like, you know what, we're gonna make them really Presbyterian, not just out of the entire British Isles. So, and we're gonna do it to win a war. So then they were allowed to send a Scottish delegation of about 20 people. And the thing is, the Scottish were not part of the divines. They were separate delegations, so they were not actually ever recorded in attendance or on the records. They had full voice and they expressed it well and used that often, but they could not vote, so they kind of kept telling them what to do, but they had no influence on it. But this actually gave them more power because they sat on every committee and had a voice in every single decision. So they really, that's some good diplomacy, I'm just saying. So then after the Solemn League and Covenant was signed and the Scottish arrived, the writing of the confession began in 1644. They had gotten through the 1 through 15 of the 39 articles, but then they realized, well, the Scottish came and they were like, that's nice, but no, we're not using that anymore. But the 39 articles do actually influence the Westminster Catechism a great deal. So the writing of the confession began in 1644, and then I just want to run through some dates real quick, y'all. 1646, the confession was finished and given to Parliament. And then in 1647, the confession was approved by the Church of Scotland. Then in 47, the larger was finished, the shorter was given to the House of Commons, blah, 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 blah. It was not approved by the, well, actually, only the catechism was approved by the Parliament in 1648, and really it was never actually approved. Except the Scottish loved it and they took it home with them. And sort of like, thanks for doing the work, we're going home, see y'all later. And in 1648, there was the purge of Parliament by Cromwell. In 1653, Cromwell was proclaimed the Lord Protector. This is the years of the English Civil War and the Commonwealth. And then because in 1648, Charles I lost his head, causing a great theological and political issue. And then in 1660, we had the restoration of the monarchy in England, and it was James II, and he was extremely Catholic, and he was mad as a wet cat, and he went real hard on being Catholic. No, he went to the episcopacy, and all of the work of the Calvinists and the Presbyterian polity was sort of thrown out the door. The Westminster Catechism was, the Westminster Confession was not approved. It was rejected. That's when the church really kind of moved away from Calvinism in the Church of England and really doubled down on a lot of their sort of the Anglican high church that we think of today. It was a complete rejection of their associations with Cromwell and all that. So, any questions so far? I know we're going fast. Okay, I got a while to go. Yeah. The theological character of the Westminster. What do y'all remember about the Westminster outside of the chief end of humankind? Defining characteristics or things that asserted. It's cool. Meta? So it does draw on Calvin, but it's truly actually a little bit more Augustine. So and Calvin draws on Augustine. So they are relating back to the theological nature of Augustine, who we all love and abide by. They did want to try to avoid, as they call them, the particular schools of thought that were very popular in the day. So they wanted to remain generally reformed so that it appealed to the masses. That still makes it extremely Calvinist. And the other thing is it's Calvinist, it's not Calvin. In recent studies, there's always been the debate of anything post-Calvin, is it Calvin or is it Calvinist? Because they were saying that Calvin's successors have lost the dynamism of Calvin, They've lost the dynamism of Calvin's biblicism, his ability to stay right to the letter of the law. So he would, so this is a document that's not really Calvin, but it's Calvinist. It's much more logical. It sort of shoves Aristotelian theology or philosophy onto the Reformed theology. And it really makes rational theology, where logic and reason are more important than biblical exactness. And it made that reason is more of a priority, and the biblical text was put into a rigid grid. They're making the scriptures work for their point. And that's what they see in the Westminster Catechism. That's one view of it. It also led Karl Barth, to say that the Westminster is a tragedy and the death of Calvinism. Woof. For something that we've upheld for so long, that's what Karl Barth thought. But then so many other people say it's actually a wonderful, beautiful reflection of Calvinism as it was understood by the English, and now it's influential today. And we have to be careful of not putting the judgment on it, so that putting judgment on it and not understanding the nuances that it actually, in all the debates of the ministers and the divines, they were all debating Old Testament and New Testament scripture proofing, and the Parliament kept asking them for proof text and proof text and proof text for all the things. That's why we have all the scriptural references in there. So they actually are extremely detailed in its scriptural adherence. But that's just one aspect of it. So it's Calvinist, not Calvin. They really wanted to avoid particular schools because there were some crazy things going on out there. And then it really sort of was, it's inclusive in terms of, it really was trying to make sure that like all the other Reformed creeds and confessions, they really liked them. Like, I mean, the Scots and the Council of Dort, Scots Confession, the Second Helvetic, the First Helvetic, all of those were really interchanged, and people really liked to use them. A lot of times they were repetitious, but they would change them up slightly to be pertinent to their community and their time. So this one was trying to be inclusive, but it actually still had a defined identity for the Reformed Church in England and Scotland. So it does 6 things to make sure that it is unique. It's one, it distances itself from Rome by calling the Pope the Antichrist. Some modern churches have decided to remove that as a little bit of an update. Then they distance themselves from Lutheranism, but in a nice way. They were like, y'all are okay, not right, but good. Then they opposed the Anabaptists, but then they really tried to help and influence another group of Baptists who would later go on to be the Methodists. And actually this pre-Methodist group just plagiarized a bunch of the Westminster Catechism and Confession and just used it for their own, which happened a ton because that's what the Westminster did to a few other things. It opposed antinomianism, which is the belief that Christ had fulfilled the law in its entirety on behalf of its people, so that it no longer had any significance for them. And this was a threat to civil society. They really thought there was a growing groundswelling of people who thought as the law is fulfilled, it would just be complete anarchy. It doesn't matter what they do. They had a standing council or committee on this issue, so that was answering daily questions about what we would do in case of these wild hooligans who believe in Christ's fulfillment of the law. It's like if Y2K was, we all remember that when the world's going to end? Yeah, this is the theological Y2K for these poor little English Reformation friends. And then they excluded Arminianism, not those nice Arminians, but the Arminianism, which is saying that God's sovereignty and human freedom are compatible. Westminster is all about God's sovereignty and the supremacy of God's sovereignty, and this was just absolutely nonsense. They are arguing that they say that grace, the Arminians say that grace is resistible, and we believe in irresistible grace, and just that just did not sit right with them, and that it actually becomes a defining point of the Church of England. And then there's another one that I will not say it because I will bastardize this French. But it says, theoretically, Christ died for all people. That's what this person was arguing, which was just appalling to them. They thought, no, Christ only died for some people. But this is saying that grace could be accessible by nature, not by acceptance of Jesus Christ. This is a French philosophy. It also influenced a whole school of thought in England. It again influenced the Anglican Church as a rejection of Calvinism later. But this is one where they said, the audacity to believe that Christ died for all people. Could you imagine, you know? I mean, universalism, whoa, what a crazy thought. No. But so the assembly, it then, as I said, in 1660, it runs through the restoration of the monarchy. James II comes back, he's livid, and they decide to just cast this out and send it back to Scotland. Scotland loved it. Immediately they adopted it as their, even before the Reformation, or even before the Restoration, they adopted it. Immediately gets adopted by the American Church in not the American Church in Paris. What am I thinking? No, the Presbyterian Church in America before it was. And they were so funny is they actually kept adapting it as they go. Because when you look at the Book of Confessions now, it's very hard to read Westminster at times, because at times it's split into and it's blank. Has anyone looked at this recently just for your bedtime reading? Shocked by all the head shakes. My goodness. I sleep with it under my pillow. That's why I know so much. No, just absorb it. No, so the Westminster Catechism, we have it in a very weird way. Or excuse me, the confession. And we actually, as you know, have the confession, the shorter and the longer, but we do not have the directory of worship and the Psalter and the governance are actually very similar to our Book of Order. So generally it's just the basic stuff, and they keep it in the original language. So it does say, what is the chief end of man? We now, for liturgical purposes, we will update the language, and that's still within keeping of our Book of Confessions. But you get to places like this, chapter 9 of the Holy Spirit. And at the very top, it says the PCUS, which is Presbyterian Church in the United States. And on the right side is the United Presbyterian Church of the United States of America. What does that mean, friends? Who remembers this pre-1983? North and South, absolutely. So they preserved what each church had, the way they had formulated it or formatted it, so that we could preserve that this confession, how it served a specific church and time for a certain people, because that's what our confessions do, is that if we change them, then we forget how they served, what they are marking about who we are as a people. It's interesting because you would think at times like the Southern Church just didn't like that. But it's really, they just reordered it. And where they're placing it shows a reflection on shows a reflection of how they theologically thought, but also pretty much the prioritization. So they really like the Holy Spirit, but the Holy Spirit doesn't appear to like chapter like 49, I think, for the PCUS. Anyways, but they continue on. There's the love of God's and mission. When the church is reunified, the Northern Church was super scared that they thought the Southern Church had no idea about missions. Little did they know, but they thought we were tea sandwiches and silver parties. And yeah, that's the thing. No, sip and seas. No, but there's a whole, actually in our section, there was actually a lot more about the mission than they ever realized. They kept it like this. When the Westminster was completed in England, it had 33 chapters. We have 35 because they've added different addendums to it. The most recent changes to the Westminster was the saying that divorce is okay, or it's, it is, you can be remarried after it. It's not like the Catholic Church. The other one is they had to assert that one was about infant baptism. They make statements about that are a little more gracious and kind in a modern context. So that's where we have all of those. In terms of, I'm trying to think, what questions do y'all have? Yes.
Blame this question on the lack of coffee in church this morning, but anyway. What is the irresistible grace?
Oh, fun. Tulip. No, tulip is the 5 tenets of Calvinism, not Calvin. Irresistible grace is that you will not, when God offers us grace, we cannot say no to it. But the question is, say what?
Some people thought you could.
Yes, the Arminians, do you think? Because they emphasize free will. And we have free will, but just a different concept of it. So yeah, irresistible grace is that it's irresistible. I saw the when I was doing research, it said resistible grace. I was like, no, that's a typo. That's not a word. That's not, those are two words you don't put together. No, it is. So irresistible grace. And we don't know how that works. And it's wonderful. And it makes a lot of people bad and a lot of people confused. And that's why I have a job. Yeah.
You mentioned the last two updates. When were those done? Remarriage and infant baptism.
What's wonderful, they're really good footnotes. See. Oh, look, I need my readers. 1903. But then they were adopted in, no, sorry, the statement on infant baptism was 1903, and then in the 50s, the PCUS adopted the statement on divorce earlier than the statement on than the Southern Church. And the reason partly that they did want to be historically accurate and theologically accurate, preserving them the way they are. It was also, the PCUS only had the Westminster and in its form that is shown here. But the Northern Church did have other confessions. I think they had the Apostles' Creed, Nicene Creed, Scots Confession, Westminster, and I guess the second Helvetic. Do you remember? Do you remember by chance? Just anyone? I don't know. Anyone in part of the Northern Church? Don't think so. Yeah. So they had a whole book of confessions that were much more comfortable, like the original reformers in Europe, where they were happy to glean and everything, but the Southerners wanted the Westminster, and that was about it. So I hold it like this is the Westminster. Okay. Where are how have you? I mean, do y'all use the Westminster? Have you thought about the Westminster? I think about it a lot. Weird. Yeah. Y'all weren't raised by my grandmother. She had to memorize the longer. Don't be the child of a minister in the Depression. There's nothing else to do. Jokes. Anyways, well, I'm trying to think. Are we ready to pass through it? I thought I forgot something to say.
Oh, another question. So, so next week, Mary Marcus can be talking about the Belhar confession. I think are there any in the church with any more confessions being thought about or debated or something?
They want to use. There's been debate about because you can have your creeds and confessions, and then you can have those that are approved for worship. So we have the Declaration of Faith, which is like absolutely like spot on the best. It's as good as the Westminster and the Apostles' Creed. It is. So when they reunified, the Southern Church actually wrote a new confession, the Declaration of Faith. We have the brief statement of faith and the Confession of 1967. And they did not adopt the Declaration of Faith, but it is a beautiful, well-written, thorough, and very approachable understanding creed and confession. That is approved for worship that we can use. And we've used it a few times here. If you ever go to University Press at Chapel Hill, they love that. The kids have memorized it. I swear it's a long one. That I would love that one to be included in our book of confessions. It will not be, but there's no discussion of a new one to be added right now. I mean, it takes forever to get them. I was at General Assembly when we voted to allow the vote the Belhar in, but that was after it had been sent back to the presbyteries and gone back to General Assembly. They have been discussing using Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail as approved for liturgical use, so that we could use that in place of an affirmation or affirmation of faith. So that's a lot easier to do, to have this approved for worship versus having something added to the confession. I could see after all the Black Lives Matters movement, I thought that there might be a movement to add in something about very specific about race, but the Belhar kind of does that with it stands against apartheid. So I'm trying to think of like what issue I could see there might be one about environmentalism probably that might come up. Trying to think of what other issues that are, what issues that we might want to respond to through a confession. It's like we had nothing, sorry.
Would that be done through the General Assembly? Would somebody make a motion or somebody make a motion?
Yeah, it would come from a presbytery with an endorsement from a second presbytery and then go to the assembly, probably be studying for 3 to 5 years. Because we love that number. And then General Assembly to vote, if they want to send it back to the presbyteries. I think we would need a 3/4 majority to change the Book of Confession. And then it would go back to General Assembly to be voted on again. So we're thorough. You know, we still don't have a statement on Vietnam, just FYI. They're still studying the Vietnam War. I know what it was, just the 3 other aspects, the Directory for Public Worship of God, the form of Presbyterial Church Government, and the Psalter. Real quickly, the Directory of Public Worship of God, it is very similar. It is wonderful to see that our sort of tradition has remained the same with that. What is the center of worship?
Preaching.
Proclamation of the gospel, absolutely. And the other one is making sure the sacraments are rightly administered. They don't want, you know, any papists taking their communion bread, watch out, and everyone got to get a communion coin and come up. Yeah, that's what, I mean, they did have to do that. But so the Directory of Public Worship, that is really, they wanted to make sure the same, they even specified the time of worship, the place of worship, because they were really speaking very specifically against the Anglican churches. They didn't want the vestments that Queen Elizabeth liked. They wanted to make sure there was also autonomy, restructuring of, oh, sorry, that's the next one, but the public worship is they had to get so specific about this to really squash others, any room for a change. Then there's the form of Presbyterial church government. Again, this is where they're trying to reorganize they were actually okay with some of the bishops. It wasn't as the pure form of Scottish Presbyterianism or as the Presbyterian that we know. It was much more, a little bit more hierarchical and had a much more Episcopal or Anglican influence on it. But you know, you got to compromise. And then the Psalter. This was, John Calvin had a Psalter. In the Reformed tradition, you were only supposed to sing from the Psalter. And this was a new writing of it. So it's like they wrote a new hymn book that would be approved for worship. Because my goodness, what if you did a jig in worship to Psalter? Because that's what Martin Luther did. He used to use drinking songs to make hymns popular, and it worked really well. John Calvin thought that was just dreadful, and how would you like dirty this word of God with a drinking or a jig? So he made sure that you had, it was only quarter notes and half notes. And you could only go 1 step up and down. It was, so, you know, the old 100th is part of John Calvin's Psalter, but this Psalter, I can't remember which, there are a couple of tunes we sing today that come from this Psalter, but this is the one that was approved for worship. So, I mean, big exciting news, you get a confession and you get a Psalter, but that is where they were. So then again, in 1660, when they had the Restoration, the king issued the Act of Uniformity, which was pretty much like get in line or get out of it. And so a lot of people had to flee to Scotland or flee to Europe. But a lot of people actually just said, okay, and they became Episcopalian again or Anglican. And there was one man who attended every single committee of the Westminster Catechism or the Westminster Assembly for 5-6 years. Every single one. This is 4 to 5 times a week that they were meeting from about 12 to 14 hours, days of fasting, all the stuff. And when the Act of Uniformity came, he then became a bishop of the Anglican Church. So I think he's had enough of the Presbyterians. But that's the quick and dirty of the Westminster Standards, all 6 of them in the Westminster Assembly. It's really fascinating. There's some wonderful books. This is a great approachable book. There's even simpler ones. John Leith loves big words. And actually, the Book of Confession has a great introduction of it to highlight some of the important theological statements, which we did a little bit of here, and then also just sort of a little bit of the history without some maniac running down dates at you for 40 minutes. But anyways, any questions? Let's see. All right, didn't this early. If I slowed down, man, that would be a long class. All right. Well, thank you all so much.
Thank you.